The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Valley as Mary walked slowly toward the general store. Her worn brown dress had been carefully mended the night before, tiny stitches holding together fabric that had seen too many washings. She held her head high, but anyone watching closely could see the weight she carried on her shoulders. 6 months. That's how long it had been since the mine accident took her husband away. 6 months since her world turned upside down and left her alone with 3 young children and bills that seemed to grow bigger every day. The bell above the store door rang as she stepped inside. Conversation stopped. Eyes turned her way, then quickly looked away. She had grown used to this reaction from the people of Cedar Valley. At first they had been kind. Neighbors brought food. Women from the church offered help. But kindness has a way of running dry when times get hard. Mary walked to the counter where Mr. Peterson, the store owner, was arranging items on the shelf behind him. She cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, Mr. Peterson." He turned around slowly, his face showing the kind of politeness people use when they don't really want to be polite. "Mrs. Johnson, what can I do for you today? I need flour and some bacon if you have it." "Just enough for a few days." Mr. Peterson's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you have money for it?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a chimney. Behind her, Mary could hear whispers starting up again. She felt heat creep up her neck. "I was hoping you might let me work for it. I could sweep the store, organize the back room. I've got all the help I need." His voice was firm. "This is a business, not a charity." More whispers. Mary's hands tightened on the small cloth bag she carried. Inside were 3 pennies and a button she had found under the kitchen table that morning. "Not enough for flour? Certainly not enough for bacon, please. Mr. Peterson, my children haven't had a proper meal in 2 days. Should have thought about that before you started putting on airs." This came from Mrs. Williams, one of the town's most respected ladies. She stood near the fabric display with 2 other women, all of them looking at Mary like she was something they had scraped off their shoes. "Putting on airs?" Mary turned to face them. "Acting like you're too good for honest work," Mrs. Williams continued. "There's plenty of women in this town who clean houses, take in washing. But you think you're above all that?" "I do take in washing," Mary said quietly. "I mend clothes. I clean Mrs. Patterson's house twice a week." "Not enough, apparently." Another woman joined the conversation. "Maybe if you sold some of those books your husband left behind instead of keeping them like treasures, you could feed your children properly." The books. Mary's chest tightened. They were the only things of value Thomas had left behind, and they weren't worth much money anyway. But they were his. He had read to her from them in the evenings, sharing stories and ideas that made their small world feel bigger. Selling them would be like selling the last pieces of his voice. "Those books aren't worth much," she said. "Worth more than your pride, I'd say." Mrs. Williams sniffed. Children need food more than their mother needs to hold on to the past. Mary felt something break inside her chest. These women, who had never known real hunger, who had never lain awake wondering how to explain to a 6-year-old why there was no supper, were telling her how to be a mother. "I'm doing the best I can," she whispered. "Are you?" The question came from Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're doing a poor job of it. Those children of yours are getting thinner every week. Maybe it's time to admit you can't take care of them properly." The words hit Mary like a physical blow. She had heard this suggestion before, whispered in corners when people thought she couldn't hear, that she should give up her children, send them to live with relatives who could provide better, or worse, to the orphanage 2 towns over. "My children are fine," she said, but her voice shook. "Are they?" Mrs. Henderson stepped closer. "Little Lucy looks pale as a ghost. And your boy, what's he now, 8? He should be in school, not running around trying to find work like a grown man." It was true. Bobby had started doing odd jobs around town, sweeping storefronts and carrying packages for a few pennies. At 8 years old, he was trying to be the man of the house. The thought made Mary's heart ache. "He goes to school," she said, "when he can. When you don't need him to work." Mrs. Henderson's voice was getting louder, drawing more attention. "That's no life for a child." Around the store, other customers had stopped pretending to shop and were openly listening now. Mary could feel their eyes on her, judging, weighing, finding her lacking. "I'm taking care of my children the best way I know how," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Well, maybe your best isn't good enough," Mrs. Williams said coldly. "Maybe it's time to think about what's really best for those children instead of what's best for your pride." Mary's hands were shaking now. She wanted to run, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. These women were saying out loud what she had feared in her darkest moments. That she was failing. That she wasn't enough. That her children would be better off without her. "I won't give up my children," she said, and this time her voice was stronger. "Then maybe you should try harder to take care of them," Mrs. Henderson replied. "Find better work. Swallow that pride of yours. Do whatever it takes." "What exactly do you suggest I do?" Mary asked. "I work every job I can find. I've sold everything we can spare. I've asked for help and been turned away. What more can I do?" The women exchanged glances. Mrs. Williams shrugged. "That's not our problem to solve. You're the one who chose to stay here instead of going to live with family. You're the one who insists on keeping that little house when you could find something cheaper. You're the one making these choices." Each word felt like a stone being thrown at her. Mary knew they weren't entirely wrong. She could have left Cedar Valley, could have taken the children to live with Thomas's sister in the next state. But this was home. This was where Thomas was buried. This was where their life together had been built, and the house, tiny as it was, had been theirs. The first place they had ever truly belonged. Giving it up felt like giving up the last piece of the life she had loved. "I'm not asking for charity," she said finally. "I'm asking for a chance to work for what I need." "And I told you I don't need any help," Mr. Peterson said from behind the counter. His voice was final. Mary nodded slowly. She had known this was how it would go, but she had hoped anyway. Hope was becoming a dangerous thing, but she couldn't seem to stop herself from feeling it. She turned toward the door, ready to leave with nothing once again. But as she reached for the handle, she heard Mrs. Williams say something that stopped her cold. "Mark my words, those children will be in the orphanage before winter's out. She's too proud to do what needs to be done and too stubborn to admit when she's beaten." Mary's hand froze on the door handle. Winter was only 2 months away, and she still had no idea how she was going to keep her family together that long. Across the dusty street from Peterson's general store, Daniel Mitchell stood in the shade of the bank building, watching the scene unfold through the large front window. He hadn't meant to spy on anyone's business, but something about the way the women had gathered around the young widow had caught his attention. Daniel was not a man who usually concerned himself with town gossip. As the owner of the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, he had bigger things to worry about. Cattle prices, weather patterns, the dozen men who worked for him and their families who depended on those jobs. But lately, he found himself noticing things he had never paid attention to before. Mainly, he found himself noticing Mary Johnson. It had started about a month ago when he was in town picking up supplies. He had seen her walking down the street with her 3 children, all of them dressed in clothes that had been carefully cleaned and mended, but were obviously worn thin. What struck him wasn't their poverty. He had grown up poor himself and knew what it looked like. What struck him was the way she held herself. Most people, when they're down on their luck, start to fold inward. Their shoulders hunch, their eyes stay on the ground, they make themselves small. But Mary Johnson walked like she still had something to be proud of. Her back was straight, her head was up, and when she spoke to her children, her voice was gentle but strong. It reminded him of his own mother. Daniel's mother had raised 5 children alone after his father died in a stampede when Daniel was 12. She had worked every job she could find, laundry, cooking, cleaning, and never once complained or made her children feel like they were a burden. She had taught them that poverty was a condition, not an identity, and that dignity was something no one could take away from you unless you let them. Watching Mary now, seeing how she faced the cruel words of those women without breaking, he saw that same strength his mother had possessed, but he also saw something else, the same exhaustion that had eventually worn his mother down until she collapsed. One day while hanging laundry and never got back up, Daniel shifted his position to get a better view through the window. He could see Mary's hands shaking as she tried to maintain her composure, could see the way her children waited outside the store, the oldest boy standing protectively in front of his 2 sisters. The boy, Bobby, Daniel thought his name was, looked too serious for his age. Like he was carrying weights that should belong to adults. That look on the boy's face made Daniel's chest tight with memory. He had worn that same expression at 8 years old, trying to be the man of the house when he was still small enough to hide behind his mother's skirts. Through the window, he watched Mrs. Williams lean closer to Mary, Her face twisted with the kind of cruel satisfaction some people get from pointing out others' failures. Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew these women, had done business with their husbands, had been to their houses for dinner parties where they served expensive food and complained about the hired help. None of them had ever missed a meal in their lives. None of them had ever had to choose between buying medicine for a sick child or keeping the heat on. Yet here they were, lecturing a woman who was doing everything she could to survive, telling her she wasn't doing enough. Daniel remembered his first winter after his father died. December had been harsh that year, and the small house where they lived was hard to heat. His mother had given her portions of food to the children, claiming she wasn't hungry while she grew thinner and thinner. She had mended their clothes by candlelight to save oil for the lamp, straining her eyes until she could barely see to thread the needle. And through it all, people in town had whispered about whether she was doing right by those children, as if watching your family struggle wasn't punishment enough, as if the constant worry about whether you could provide for the people you loved most wasn't already eating you alive from the inside. Daniel watched Mary's face as the women continued their assault. He could see her trying to stay strong, but he could also see the cracks forming, the way her hands trembled slightly, the way she blinked too fast, fighting back tears she couldn't afford to show. He had seen that look before too, on his mother's face in those final months when the weight of keeping everyone together was slowly crushing her. She had never asked for help. Pride and fear had kept her silent. Pride because she didn't want to be seen as a beggar, and fear because she was terrified someone might decide she wasn't capable of caring for her children and take them away. Looking at Mary now, Daniel realized she was caught in the same terrible trap. The people of Cedar Valley were criticizing her for not doing enough. But if she showed just how desperate things really were, they might use that desperation against her. They might decide she was unfit and try to take her children away. It was a game she couldn't win. Daniel had money now, more than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. His ranch was successful beyond anything he had dreamed of as a poor boy helping his mother take in washing. He employed half the men in the county and was respected by everyone who knew him. But none of that success had come fast enough to save his mother. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he wondered what would have happened if someone with means had stepped in to help when she needed it most. If someone had offered her work that paid enough to feed her family without killing herself. If someone had shown her the same consideration these wealthy women expected for themselves, but no one had. His mother had died exhausted and worn out at 38 years old, and Daniel had spent the rest of his life making sure he would never be helpless like that again. Now, watching Mary try to maintain her dignity while being torn apart by people who had never known real hardship, Daniel felt something shift inside his chest. Maybe he couldn't save his mother, but he was in a position to help someone else's mother, someone else's children. The question was how to do it without making things worse. Daniel knew Cedar Valley well enough to understand that his intervention could be a double-edged sword. If he helped Mary too openly, it might start different kinds of gossip. People might think he had improper intentions. They might whisper about why a wealthy bachelor would take such an interest in a young widow. That kind of talk could destroy her reputation and make her situation even more difficult. But if he did nothing, she might not make it through the winter. Those children might end up in the orphanage after all, split up and sent to different places, their family destroyed by circumstances that weren't anyone's fault. Through the window, Daniel saw Mary turn toward the door empty-handed again. Her shoulders were rigid with the effort of not breaking down in front of everyone. Outside, her children straightened up when they saw her coming, their young faces alert and worried. The oldest boy, Bobby, stepped forward as she emerged from the store. Daniel was too far away to hear what was said, but he could see the way the boy's face fell when he realized his mother hadn't been able to get what they needed, could see the way Mary knelt down to speak to her youngest daughter, probably explaining why they would have to wait another day for a proper meal. The little girl nodded solemnly, as if she was used to disappointment. That acceptance on such a young face made Daniel's hands curl into fists. No child should have to get used to being hungry. No mother should have to explain why she couldn't provide basic necessities. And no family should have to face that struggle alone while people who could help chose instead to judge and criticize. Daniel made a decision. He couldn't fix everything overnight, and he couldn't erase the gossip or change the cruel nature of some people, But he had resources, and he had influence, and he had the memory of his own mother's struggle to guide him. He was going to help Mary Johnson, one way or another. The trick would be figuring out how to do it right. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday that started like any other, everything changed. Mary woke to the sound of her youngest daughter coughing. Little Annie had been fighting a cold for days, but this morning was different. When Mary pressed her hand against Annie's forehead, the heat nearly burned her palm. "Mama," Annie whispered, her voice rough and small. "I don't feel good." Mary's heart dropped into her stomach. She had seen fevers like this before. During the hard winter 2 years ago, when sickness had swept through the town like wildfire, taking the weak and the young. Thomas had been alive then, and they had managed to pay for medicine. But now, "Bobby," Mary called to her son, who was getting dressed in the corner of the small room all 3 children shared. "Run to Doc Bradley's office. Tell him Annie needs to be seen today." Bobby was 8 years old, but he had learned to read situations the way grown men read newspapers. He looked at his little sister's flushed face, then at his mother's worried expression, and nodded seriously. "Should I tell him we can pay?" he asked quietly. The question broke Mary's heart. Her 8-year-old son was already learning to think about money when his sister was sick. Learning to worry about things no child should have to consider. "Just tell him she needs help," Mary said. "Go quickly." While Bobby ran to the doctor's office, Mary tried to cool Annie's fever with damp cloths and get her to drink small sips of water. Lucy, her middle child, sat quietly nearby, watching with the solemn expression that had become too common on her 6-year-old face. Bobby returned within an hour, but the look on his face told Mary everything she needed to know before he said a word. "Doc Bradley says..." Bobby's voice was careful, like he was trying to be grown up about delivering bad news. "He says he can't see her unless we can pay first. He says our credit isn't good anymore." Mary closed her eyes for a moment. She had known this day would come. Dr. Bradley had been patient for months, seeing the children when they needed care, and adding the charges to a bill that kept growing. "But patience, like kindness, has its limits. How much does he want?" she asked. $2 for the visit. More if she needs medicine. $2. Mary had 17 cents to her name. Even if she sold everything they owned, she couldn't come up with $2 by the end of the day. "Mama," Annie whispered. "Am I going to die?" "No, sweetheart," Mary said quickly, smoothing her daughter's damp hair. "No, you're going to be fine. Mama's going to take care of everything." But as she said the words, Mary wasn't sure how she could make them true. She spent the morning trying to find a solution. She went to 3 different neighbors, swallowing what was left of her pride to ask for a loan. 2 of them claimed they didn't have money to spare. The third, Mrs. Patterson, who Mary cleaned house for twice a week, offered 50 cents and a lecture about planning better for emergencies. By afternoon, Annie's fever had gotten worse. She was barely awake, and when she was, she complained that her head hurt and her throat was on fire. Mary knew she couldn't wait any longer. With Annie wrapped in their only good blanket and Bobby and Lucy walking quietly beside her, Mary made her way to Dr. Bradley's office. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and by the time they reached the doctor's building, Annie was limp in her arms. The waiting room was nearly full when they entered. Mrs. Henderson was there with her daughter, who had apparently twisted her ankle. Mrs. Williams sat in a corner chair, fanning herself and discussing the weather with another woman. Several other town ladies were scattered around the room, some with children, others just visiting to hear the latest gossip. Mary approached the desk where Dr. Bradley's assistant, Miss Porter, sat writing in a large book. "Please," Mary said quietly, "my daughter is very sick. She needs to see the doctor right away." Miss Porter looked up with the expression of someone who was tired of dealing with unpleasant situations. "Mrs. Johnson, I thought Bobby explained the situation to you this morning. Payment is required before any services can be provided. I understand that, but she's getting worse. She needs help now. I'll find a way to pay, I promise." "Promises don't pay bills," Miss Porter said coldly. "If you can't pay today, you'll need to come back when you can." Around the waiting room, conversations had stopped. Mary could feel eyes watching her, judging her. She felt Annie's small body burning with fever in her arms and knew she was running out of options. "Please," she said again, louder this time. "She's just a little girl. She's sick. And I'm sure you'll find a way to get her the help she needs," Miss Porter replied. "But not here. Not today." From across the room, Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Well, I have to say, I'm not surprised it's come to this. Mary turned to look at her. Mrs. Henderson was sitting up straight in her chair, her face set in lines of disapproval. Excuse me? This is exactly what happens when people don't face reality. Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. When they're too proud to ask for proper help, too stubborn to make the hard decisions that need to be made. I don't understand what you mean, Mary said, though she was afraid she did understand. I mean, Mrs. Henderson said, standing up now, that child is suffering because you refuse to admit you can't take care of your children properly. The words hit Mary like a physical blow. Around the room, other women were nodding in agreement. Mrs. Williams stepped forward. She's right, you know. This is what we've all been trying to tell you. You're not doing those children any favors by keeping them when you can't provide for them. I am providing for them, Mary said, her voice shaking. I work every day. I do everything I can. Everything except what's best for them, another woman added. Look at that poor child, burning up with fever while you stand here arguing about money you don't have. Mary felt the room spinning around her. These women who claimed to be pillars of the community were using her daughter's illness to prove their point. They were standing in a doctor's office, watching a sick child suffer, and using it as an opportunity to lecture her about her failures as a mother. What exactly are you suggesting I do? Mary asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What we've all been suggesting for months, Mrs. Henderson replied. Except that you can't handle this alone. Let someone who can actually provide for these children take care of them. You mean give them up? I mean do what's best for them instead of what's best for your pride. The room was completely silent now except for Annie's labored breathing. Mary looked around at the faces surrounding her. Women she had known for years, women who went to the same church. Women who claimed to care about children and families and doing the right thing. Not one of them was offering to help. Not one of them was suggesting they pool their resources to pay for Annie's care. Not one of them was looking at a sick child and thinking about anything except how her illness proved their point about Mary's inadequacy as a mother. My children are not burdens to be gotten rid of, Mary said, finding her voice again. They are my family. A family you can't support, Mrs. Williams shot back. A family that's suffering because of your stubbornness. Mary felt tears threatening, but she refused to cry in front of these women. She had one card left to play, and she was going to play it. If paying for the doctor's visit is all that stands between my daughter and the help she needs, she said slowly, then I'll find a way to pay for it right now. She looked around the room at the well-dressed women, at their expensive jewelry and fine clothes. Surely one of you Christian ladies could loan me $2 to help a sick child. I'll work it off. I'll clean your houses for free, take in your laundry, do whatever you need. But please help my daughter. The silence that followed was deafening. Mary watched as these women, who spent their Sundays singing hymns about charity and kindness, avoided her eyes and found suddenly fascinating things to look at on the floor and walls. Finally, Mrs. Henderson spoke. This is exactly the problem. You think everyone else should solve your difficulties for you. Mary felt something break inside her chest, not just her heart, but something deeper. Some fundamental belief she had held about people, about community, about what it meant to live in a place where everyone was supposed to look out for each other. She was standing in a room full of people who could easily afford to help a sick child, and they were choosing not to because they disapproved of her pride. They would rather let Annie suffer than admit that their judgment of Mary might be wrong. As Mary stood there, holding her burning daughter and facing the cold stares of women who had decided she was unworthy of basic human compassion, she realized she had reached the end of her rope. She had tried everything, asked everyone, and still come up empty. And that's when she heard footsteps behind her, and a deep voice that cut through the silence like lightning through a dark sky. That won't be necessary. The voice came from behind Mary, deep and steady and carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room turn to look. Mary spun around, careful not to jostle Annie, and found herself face to face with Daniel Mitchell. She had seen him around town, of course. Everyone in Cedar Valley knew who Daniel Mitchell was. He owned the biggest ranch in the county, employed dozens of men, and was generally considered one of the most successful people for miles around. But Mary had never spoken to him directly. Men like Daniel Mitchell moved in different circles than struggling widows. Now he was standing in Dr. Bradley's waiting room, his hat in his hands and his eyes focused on Miss Porter behind the desk. Mr. Mitchell, Miss Porter stammered. clearly flustered by his sudden appearance. "I didn't realize you had an appointment today." "I don't," Daniel said simply. "I'm here about Mrs. Johnson's daughter." Mary felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Bad enough that half the town's most prominent women had witnessed her humiliation. Now Daniel Mitchell was here to see it too. "The child needs medical attention," Daniel continued, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to arrange for Dr. Bradley to see her immediately." "Well, yes, of course," Miss Porter said, glancing nervously between Daniel and Mary. "But there's the matter of payment." "Put it on my account," Daniel said. "All of it. Today's visit, any medicine she needs, and any follow-up care." The silence in the room was so complete that Mary could hear her own heartbeat. Annie stirred weakly in her arms, and Mary realized her daughter's fever seemed to be getting worse by the minute. "Mr. Mitchell," Mary began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't let you—" "You're not letting me do anything," Daniel said, turning to look at her directly for the first time. His eyes were kind, but there was steel underneath the kindness. "I'm choosing to do this. But I don't have any way to pay you back. I'm not asking you to pay me back." Mary felt the room spinning again, but this time it wasn't from despair. It was from the shock of unexpected kindness from someone who had no reason to help her. "I don't understand," she said. Daniel's eyes moved around the room, taking in the faces of the women who had spent the last 15 minutes explaining why Mary didn't deserve help. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge that made several of them step backward. "Sometimes neighbors help neighbors," he said. "Sometimes people do what's right just because it's right. Sometimes a sick child gets the care she needs without everyone standing around debating whether her mother deserves it." Mrs. Henderson's face turned red. "Now see here, Mr. Mitchell, you don't understand the situation." "I understand it perfectly," Daniel replied, his voice still calm but somehow more dangerous than if he had been shouting. "I understand that there's a sick child who needs a doctor, and I understand that there are people in this room who could easily help, but are choosing not to. What I don't understand is why anyone thinks that's acceptable." "It's not about the money," Mrs. Williams protested. "It's about teaching responsibility. It's about making sure people face the consequences of their choices." Daniel turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her take a step back. "Mrs. Williams," he said quietly, "what choices do you think Mrs. Johnson made that led to her husband dying in a mine accident?" Mrs. Williams opened her mouth, then closed it again. "What choices did she make that led to being left alone with 3 children and no income?" Daniel continued. "What choices did she make that led to stores refusing her credit and people refusing her work?" "She could have left town," Mrs. Henderson said defensively. "She could have gone to live with family." "And why should she have to leave her home?" Daniel asked. "Why should she have to uproot her children and leave everything familiar behind just because her husband died?" "Because that's how life works," Mrs. Henderson replied. "Sometimes you have to make hard choices." "You're right," Daniel said. "Sometimes you do have to make hard choices. And today I'm choosing to help a neighbor in need." "What are you choosing to do?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Around the room, the women who had been so vocal about Mary's failures suddenly found they had nothing to say. Miss Porter cleared her throat nervously. I'll get Dr. Bradley right away, Mr. Mitchell." "Thank you," Daniel said. Then he turned back to Mary. "Ma'am, would you like to sit down? You look like you've been carrying her for a while." Mary nodded, not trusting her voice. Daniel gestured toward an empty chair, and she sank into it gratefully. Annie's fever was making her heavier than usual, and Mary's arms were aching from holding her for so long. "Thank you," Mary whispered as Daniel took the chair beside her. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Daniel said. "How long has she been sick?" 3 days, but she got worse this morning." "The fever just won't break," Daniel nodded. "Dr. Bradley is good with children. He'll know what to do." Bobby and Lucy had been standing quietly near the door throughout the entire scene, watching with the wide eyes of children who had learned too young that adult conversations could determine their fate. Now Bobby stepped forward. "Are you really going to pay for Annie to see the doctor?" he asked Daniel. "I am," Daniel replied. "Why?" It was such a simple question, but Mary could see it had caught Daniel off guard. He looked at Bobby for a long moment. The serious 8-year-old boy who had learned to worry about money and medicine and whether his family would stay together. "Because she's sick and she needs help," Daniel said finally. "That's enough reason for me." Bobby nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to him even though the adults in the room had been making it seem impossible. Dr. Bradley appeared from his back office. a tall, thin man with gray hair and tired eyes. He looked around the waiting room, taking in the tension that still hung in the air like fog. "Miss Porter says there's a sick child," he said. "This is Annie Johnson," Daniel said, standing up. "She's had a fever for 3 days, and it's getting worse." Dr. Bradley's eyes moved from Daniel to Mary to the child in her arms. Whatever he thought about the situation, he kept it to himself. "Let's have a look at her then," he said. "Bring her back to the examination room." Mary stood up carefully, Annie's weight making her legs unsteady. As she followed Dr. Bradley toward the back of the office, she heard Daniel speak to Miss Porter. "Make sure Mrs. Johnson has everything she needs," he said. "If the child needs medicine, if there are follow-up visits, if anything else comes up, it all goes on my account. And I want to be clear about this. Mrs. Johnson and her children are to receive the same level of care you would give to anyone else in this town. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Mitchell. Absolutely." As Mary disappeared into the doctor's office with Annie, the waiting room behind her remained silent. For the first time in months, she wasn't worried about money or credit or whether she could afford to get help for her child. For the first time in months, she could focus entirely on making sure Annie got better. And for the first time in months, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't facing this struggle completely alone. In the examination room, Dr. Bradley was gentle and thorough as he checked Annie's temperature, looked in her throat, and listened to her breathing. "It's a throat infection," he told Mary. "Painful but treatable. I'll give you some medicine for the fever and something to help with the pain. She should start feeling better within a day or two." Mary felt tears of relief threatening. "And the medicine is already paid for," Dr. Bradley said quietly. Mr. Mitchell was very clear about that. As they prepared to leave the doctor's office, Mary tried to process what had just happened. A man she barely knew had stepped in to help her family when no one else would. He had faced down the most influential women in town and made it clear that their judgment of her didn't matter to him. But more than that, he had done it without making her feel small or ashamed. He hadn't lectured her about responsibility or made her beg. He had simply seen a problem and solved it, as if helping a neighbor was the most natural thing in the world. Walking out of the doctor's office with medicine for Annie and a follow-up appointment already scheduled, Mary felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just for Annie's recovery, but for the possibility that maybe there were still good people in the world. Maybe there were still people who believed in helping others without expecting anything in return. She had no idea that this was only the beginning. 5 days after Annie's fever broke, Mary was hanging laundry behind her small house when she saw Daniel Mitchell walking up the dirt path toward her front door. Her heart jumped into her throat. She had been wondering when he might come to collect payment for the doctor's bills, and she still had no idea how she would manage it. She quickly wiped her damp hands on her apron and hurried around to the front of the house, where Daniel was standing beside the small gate that marked the boundary of her tiny yard. He held his hat in his hands and looked surprisingly nervous for a man who owned half the county. "Mr. Mitchell," Mary said, smoothing her hair self-consciously. "I wasn't expecting you. I hope I'm not intruding. Mrs. Johnson, I was wondering if we might talk." Mary glanced toward the house, where she could hear Bobby and Lucy playing a quiet game while Annie napped. The little girl was almost completely recovered thanks to Dr. Bradley's medicine. "Of course," Mary said. "Would you like to come inside? I'm afraid I don't have much to offer you." "Actually," Daniel said, "I was hoping we might walk a bit, if you don't mind leaving the children for a few minutes." Mary hesitated. Bobby was old enough to watch his sisters for a short while, but she hated leaving them alone. Too many things could go wrong when you weren't watching. As if he could read her thoughts, Daniel said, "We won't go far. Just to the end of the street and back." "Bobby," Mary called through the open window, "I'm going to step outside for a few minutes. Watch your sisters." "Yes, Mama," came Bobby's serious voice. Mary joined Daniel outside the gate and they began walking slowly down the dusty street. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Mary found herself stealing glances at him, trying to figure out what he wanted to discuss. He was a handsome man, she realized, tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes and hands that looked like they had done real work despite his wealth. "Annie seems to be feeling better," Daniel said finally. "Much better, thanks to you," Mary replied. "Mr. Mitchell, I know you said I didn't need to pay you back, but I can't just accept such a generous gift. If you'll give me time, I'll find a way to repay every penny." Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her. Mrs. Johnson, I meant what I said. I don't want your money. Then what do you want? The question came out more bluntly than Mary had intended, but she was tired of not understanding what was happening in her life. Daniel looked down at his hat, turning it over in his hands. I want to make you an offer, a proposition that might benefit both of us. Mary felt her stomach tighten. She had heard of wealthy men making propositions to women in desperate circumstances, and she had always sworn she would rather starve than accept that kind of help. What kind of proposition? She asked carefully. Daniel seemed to realize what she was thinking because his face flushed red. Nothing improper, Mrs. Johnson. I'm talking about marriage. Mary's mouth fell open. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was the last one. Marriage? She repeated. Yes, a marriage that would benefit both of us. You need security for yourself and your children. Daniel paused as if he wasn't sure how to explain what he needed. I need a wife. Mary stared at him. Mr. Mitchell, we barely know each other. You've spoken to me exactly twice in my entire life. I know that, but I've been watching you for weeks, Mrs. Johnson. I've seen how you handle yourself when people are cruel to you. I've seen how you care for your children. I've seen that you have strength and dignity even when you have nothing else. That's not enough reason to marry someone, Mary said, though her heart was beating fast. Isn't it? Daniel asked. People marry for worse reasons all the time. They marry for money or social position or because their families arrange it. At least we would be marrying with honest intentions. Mary started walking again, needing to move while she processed what he was saying. Daniel fell into step beside her. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. I'm proposing a partnership, Daniel said. You would come to live at my ranch with your children. You would be my wife in name and in law. Your children would have everything they need, food, clothes, education, medical care. You would never have to worry about money again. And in return, you would help me manage my household. I have a large house and a ranch that employs dozens of people. I need someone who can handle the domestic side of things, planning meals, managing the household staff, entertaining business associates when necessary. Mary considered this. It sounded almost too good to be true. And what about the other aspects of marriage? Daniel's face reddened again. I would never ask anything of you that you weren't willing to give. We would be partners first. Anything beyond that would be your choice in your own time. They had reached the end of the street and turned back toward Mary's house. She could see her small rented cottage in the distance with its patched roof and tiny yard. Inside that house, her children were making do with too little food, too few clothes, and too much uncertainty about their future. Why me? Mary asked. You could marry anyone. You could marry someone from a wealthy family, someone who would bring you social connections or business advantages. I could, Daniel agreed. But I don't want to marry someone from a wealthy family. I want to marry someone who understands what it means to work hard and struggle and still keep going. I want to marry someone who will appreciate what we have instead of always wanting more. Mary looked at him sideways. Is that really the only reason? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. No, he said finally. It's not the only reason. The truth is I admire you, Mrs. Johnson. I admire how you've handled everything that's happened to you. I admire how you refuse to give up on your children no matter how hard things get. I admire how you keep your dignity even when people try to take it away from you. Admiration isn't love, Mary said softly. No, it's not. But it's a better foundation for marriage than most people have, and it's something that can grow into love given time. They had reached Mary's gate again. She stood there, her hand on the wooden post, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. This is all very sudden, she said. I know it is, and I'm not asking for an answer right now. Take time to think about it. Consider what would be best for you and your children. Mary looked at her little house, then back at Daniel. What would people say? About you marrying someone like me? Someone like you. Someone poor. Someone with children. Someone who was desperate enough to accept help from a stranger. Daniel's expression hardened. Let me worry about what people say. And Mrs. Johnson, you may be poor, but you are not someone to be ashamed of. You are a woman who has faced terrible circumstances with grace and strength. Any man would be lucky to have you as his wife. Mary felt tears threatening again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. When was the last time anyone had said something kind about her? When was the last time anyone had seen her as something other than a burden or a failure? I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say you'll think about it, Daniel said. That's all I'm asking. Mary nodded. I'll think about it. Good. Daniel put his hat back on and tipped it to her. Take all the time you need. I'll be around town if you want to talk more. As he walked away, Mary stood at her gate watching him go. Inside the house, she could hear Annie's laughter as she played with her siblings. The sound made her chest tight with emotion. For 6 months, she had been fighting to keep her family together, scraping by day after day, never knowing if she would have enough money for food or rent or medicine. She had endured the gossip and the judgment and the constant fear that someone might decide she wasn't fit to care for her children. Now Daniel Mitchell was offering her a way out of all of that. Security for her children, a home where they would never go hungry, an end to the daily struggle that was slowly wearing her down. But marriage to a man she barely knew? Marriage without love, based only on mutual need and respect? Mary touched the simple gold band she still wore on her finger, the one Thomas had placed there 7 years ago. She had loved Thomas with all her heart. Their marriage had been built on real love, shared dreams, and deep affection. Could she really enter into a marriage that was more like a business arrangement? As she walked back into her house, Mary realized that the answer to that question might depend on what she was willing to sacrifice for her children's future. And that was a question that would require a lot more thinking. 2 weeks later, Mary stood in front of the cracked mirror in her bedroom, smoothing the skirt of a dress she had never expected to own. The soft blue fabric felt strange under her fingers, too fine, too new, too beautiful for someone like her to be wearing. The dress had appeared 3 days ago, delivered by Mrs. Patterson with a message that Daniel had arranged for it to be made. Mary had protested, saying she could wear her old brown dress for the wedding, but Mrs. Patterson had shaken her head firmly. Mr. Mitchell was very specific, she had said. He wants you to have a proper wedding dress. And if you ask me, it's about time someone treated you the way you deserve to be treated. Now, looking at herself in the mirror, Mary hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. The blue dress brought out the color of her eyes and fit her perfectly. Her hair, which she had washed with the last of her good soap, fell in soft waves around her shoulders. For the first time in months, she looked like someone who might be worthy of a wealthy man's attention. But beneath the surface, her stomach was churning with nervousness and doubt. "Mama, you look beautiful," Lucy said from where she sat on the bed, dressed in her own new dress, a simple yellow cotton that made her look like a little ray of sunshine. "Like a real princess," Annie added, twirling in her green dress. The little girl had fully recovered from her illness and was delighted by the prospect of living in the big house, as she called Daniel's ranch. Bobby, dressed in new trousers and a white shirt, looked more serious. At 8 years old, he understood better than his sisters that this marriage would change everything about their lives. "Are you sure about this, Mama?" he asked quietly. Mary sat down beside him on the bed and took his hands in hers. "What do you think, Bobby? Are you worried?" Bobby considered the question with the gravity he brought to everything these days. "I like Mr. Mitchell," he said finally. "He seems like a good man, and I like that we won't have to worry about money anymore. But," Mary could hear the reservation in his voice, "but I miss Papa, and this feels like we're saying goodbye to him." Mary's throat tightened. Bobby was too young to carry such heavy thoughts, but circumstances had forced him to grow up fast. "We're not saying goodbye to Papa," she said gently. "We're never going to forget him or stop loving him. But Papa would want us to be safe and happy, don't you think? He would want you and your sisters to have enough to eat and warm clothes and the chance to go to school." Bobby nodded slowly. "Mr. Mitchell says there's a school right in town that I can attend every day, and that Lucy and Annie can go to when they're old enough." "That's right. And you'll have your own room in the big house and books to read. And you won't have to work so hard anymore," Bobby said, looking up at her with eyes that had seen too much worry for someone his age. "You won't have to stay up late mending clothes and getting up early to do washing. You won't have to skip meals so we can eat." Mary felt tears prick her eyes. She hadn't realized Bobby had noticed her going without food, but of course he had. Children noticed everything, especially when their world felt uncertain. "No," she said softly. "I won't have to do those things anymore." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Mary opened it to find Mrs. Patterson standing outside with a small bouquet of wildflowers. "These are from Mr. Mitchell," she said, handing them to Mary. "He thought you might like to carry them today." The flowers were simple. Daisies and black-eyed Susans and a few sprigs of baby's breath. but they had been carefully arranged and tied with a blue ribbon that matched her dress. The thoughtfulness of the gesture made Mary's chest tight with emotion. "It's time to go," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "The whole town will be at the church." Mary's stomach dropped.
The whole town?
"Well, you know how these things are. Word gets around. I think people are curious to see Daniel Mitchell get married." Mary could imagine the kind of curiosity that would bring people to her wedding. Not the happy excitement that usually surrounded such occasions, but the gossipy fascination of people wanting to see how this unusual situation would play out. The walk to the church felt like the longest of Mary's life. People lined the streets, some offering genuine smiles and congratulations, others simply staring with undisguised curiosity. Mary held her head high and kept her eyes focused on the small white church at the end of the street. Daniel was waiting at the altar when she entered, dressed in a dark suit that made him look even more handsome than usual. When he saw her, his face lit up with something that looked suspiciously like genuine admiration. The church was packed. Mary recognized faces from all over town, people who had been kind to her, people who had ignored her, and people who had been downright cruel. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Williams sat in the front row, their faces carefully neutral. As Mary walked down the aisle with her children beside her, she could hear the whispers that followed in her wake. "Can you believe it? Lucky woman. Wonder what he sees in her. Those poor children being dragged into this." Well, she certainly landed on her feet. Mary forced herself to ignore the comments and focus on Daniel's face. He was watching her with steady, kind eyes, and when she reached the altar, he offered her his arm with a small smile. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, meant only for her ears. "Thank you," she whispered back, "for everything." The ceremony itself was simple. Pastor Williams, no relation to the gossipy Mrs. Williams, spoke about partnership and mutual support, about the blessing of family and the importance of caring for one another. When it came time for vows, Daniel spoke first. "I promise to care for you and your children as if they were my own," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to protect you from hardship and to treat you with the respect and kindness you deserve. I promise to be faithful to you and to honor the trust you're placing in me today." When it was Mary's turn, she looked into Daniel's eyes and saw nothing but honesty there. "I promise to be a faithful wife and partner to you," she said. "I promise to care for your home and to stand by your side in good times and difficult ones. I promise to honor the generosity you've shown my family and to work every day to be worthy of it." When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel leaned down to kiss her gently on the cheek. It was a respectful, appropriate kiss that nonetheless made Mary's heart flutter in a way she hadn't expected. As they turned to face the congregation as a married couple, Mary saw a sea of faces looking back at her. Some expressions were genuinely happy, others were calculating, and a few were openly disapproving. But for the first time in months, none of it mattered to her. She was no longer Mary Johnson, the struggling widow who couldn't pay her bills. She was now Mary Mitchell, wife to one of the most respected men in the county. Her children were now part of a family that could provide for them properly. Whatever people thought about how this marriage had come about, the fact remained that it had solved the most pressing problems in her life. After the ceremony, there was a small reception at the church. People who had barely spoken to Mary in months suddenly wanted to congratulate her and wish her well. She accepted their good wishes with grace, but she couldn't help noticing how different their treatment of her was now that she carried the Mitchell name. Mrs. Henderson approached her near the end of the reception, her face wearing an expression that might have been meant as friendly. "Well, Mary," she said, "I suppose everything worked out for the best after all." "Yes," Mary replied simply. "I suppose it did. I hope you appreciate what a fortunate woman you are. Not many people get a second chance like this." Mary looked at Mrs. Henderson for a long moment, remembering the day in the doctor's office when this same woman had suggested that Mary's children would be better off without her. "I do appreciate it," Mary said finally, "and I intend to make the most of it." As the reception wound down, Daniel approached her with a gentle smile. "Are you ready to see your new home?" he asked. Mary looked around at her children, who were practically vibrating with excitement about the adventure ahead of them. Bobby looked nervous but determined. Lucy and Annie were chattering excitedly about having their own rooms and maybe getting a pony. "Yes," Mary said, and realized she meant it. I'm ready. As they walked out of the church together, Daniel, Mary, and the 3 children who were now his stepchildren, Mary felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope for the future. Not just hope that they would survive, but hope that they might actually thrive. The gossips would talk, of course. They would speculate about why Daniel had married her, and whether it would last. They would watch for signs that the arrangement wasn't working, and be ready to say, I told you so, if things went wrong. But as Mary looked at her new husband walking beside her, patient and kind and genuine in his desire to help her family, she thought that maybe, just maybe, this unusual beginning might lead to something truly good. Only time would tell if a marriage built on mutual need and respect could grow into something deeper. But for now, for today, it was enough that her children would sleep tonight in warm beds with full stomachs, secure in the knowledge that they were wanted and cared for. Everything else they would figure out as they went along. 3 months into their marriage, Mary stood on the wide front porch of the Mitchell ranch house, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The view still took her breath away, rolling hills dotted with cattle, fields stretching to the horizon, and a sense of space and possibility that she had never experienced in the cramped quarters of town. The house itself was larger than anything she had ever dreamed of living in. 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with 8 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, a formal dining room, and a parlor that could comfortably seat 20 people. When Daniel had first shown her through it on their wedding day, Mary had felt overwhelmed by the sheer size of it all. Now, 3 months later, it was beginning to feel like home. Mama, Annie's voice carried across the yard from where she was chasing chickens near the barn. The little girl had adapted to ranch life with the enthusiasm only a 4-year-old could manage. She had appointed herself chief caretaker of the chickens, and spent hours each day talking to them as if they were her personal friends. Lucy was sitting on the porch steps, carefully braiding wildflowers into a crown while humming to herself. At 6, she had discovered that the ranch was full of wonderful places to explore and beautiful things to collect. Her room was filled with interesting rocks, pressed flowers, and feathers from various birds that lived on the property. Bobby was in the barn with Daniel, learning how to care for the horses. At 8, he was still serious and thoughtful, but Mary had watched him begin to relax as the constant worry about money and survival had faded from their daily lives. He was even starting to laugh more, something that made Mary's heart sing every time she heard it. The sound of boots on the porch boards made her turn around. Daniel was walking toward her, his work shirt already dusty from morning chores and his face wearing the slightly tired but satisfied expression of a man who had been up since dawn taking care of his land and animals. "Good morning," he said, settling into the chair beside hers. It had become their routine, meeting on the porch for a few minutes before the day got too busy, sharing coffee and talking about whatever needed to be discussed. "Good morning," Mary replied, pouring him a cup of coffee from the pot she had brought outside.
"How are the cattle in the south pasture?"
"Doing well. I think we'll have a good year if the weather holds." Daniel accepted the coffee gratefully and took a long sip. "What about you? How are the preparations for Saturday's dinner party coming along?" Mary felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Saturday would mark the first time she had hosted a formal dinner party as Daniel's wife. He had business associates coming from 2 neighboring towns along with their wives, and Mary was determined to prove that she could handle the social responsibilities that came with being married to a successful rancher. "I think everything will be ready," she said. "Mrs. Davis has been helping me plan the menu, and we've prepared the guest rooms. I just hope I don't embarrass you." Daniel set down his coffee cup and turned to look at her directly. "Mary, you could never embarrass me. You've been managing this household better than it's ever been managed. The men respect you, the house runs smoothly, and you've made this place feel like a real home for the first time since my mother died." Mary felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. Over the past 3 months, she had thrown herself into learning how to manage the Mitchell ranch household. It was a big job, cooking for the ranch hands, managing supplies, overseeing the cleaning and maintenance of the large house, and handling the social obligations that came with Daniel's position in the community. But it was also deeply satisfying work. For the first time in her adult life, Mary had enough resources to do things properly. She could plan meals without worrying about the cost of ingredients. She could replace worn-out linens without calculating whether they could afford it. She could focus on doing things well instead of just doing whatever was cheapest. "I never thanked you properly," she said quietly, "for giving me the chance to prove I could do this. Most people in town thought you were crazy for marrying me." "Most people in town don't know what they're talking about," Daniel replied. "You've exceeded every expectation I had, and I had high expectations to begin with." Mary looked out across the ranch, watching Bobby and one of the ranch hands lead a horse out of the barn. "It's been good for the children, too. I haven't seen them this happy since before Thomas died." "They're good kids," Daniel said. "Bobby's got a real feel for the horses. I think he might have a future in ranching if that's what he wants. And the girls are smart as whips. Lucy was reading to me from one of the books in the library yesterday, and I swear she understood it better than I did." The library had been another wonderful surprise. Daniel's house contained more books than Mary had ever seen in one place outside of the town library. When she had mentioned this to him, he had told her they were hers to enjoy as much as his. Some evenings after the children were in bed and the day's work was done, they would sit in the library together, reading quietly by lamplight. "Daniel," Mary said, then hesitated. Over the past 3 months, their relationship had been unfailingly polite and respectful. He had kept his word about not pressuring her for anything beyond partnership and friendship. But lately, Mary had found herself wanting to know more about the man she had married. "What is it?" he asked gently. "I was wondering. Why did you never marry before?" "You're a good man with a successful ranch. I'm sure there were plenty of women who would have been interested." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the horizon. "There were a few women over the years who made it clear they'd be interested in becoming Mrs. Mitchell," he said finally. "But I always got the feeling they were more interested in the ranch and the money than they were in me. That must have been lonely." "It was. But I figured it was better to be alone than to be married to someone who saw me as a means to an end." He glanced at her sideways, present company excluded, of course. Mary felt her cheeks warm. "I hope you know that this isn't just about the security for me anymore." "What do you mean?" Mary took a deep breath, gathering courage for what she wanted to say. "I mean that when we got married, it was about practical things, about what we could do for each other. But these past few months, getting to know you, seeing how kind you are with the children, watching how you treat everyone from the ranch hands to the women in town with respect, I've come to care about you as more than just a business partner." Daniel's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "Mary, I know that wasn't part of our agreement," she said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything from you. I just wanted you to know that this marriage has become more real for me than I expected it to." Daniel set down his cup and turned his body toward her, his expression serious. "Can I tell you something?" Mary nodded. "I didn't just marry you because I needed a wife to manage my household," he said. "I married you because from the first time I saw you handling those awful women in town with such dignity, I knew you were the kind of person I wanted to spend my life with. I married you because you were strong and brave and beautiful, and because I hoped that maybe if I was patient and kind, you might eventually come to care for me the way I was already starting to care for you." Mary's heart began beating faster. "You were already starting to care for me? Before we were married?" "I was more than starting to care for you," Daniel said quietly. "Mary, I was falling in love with you before I ever worked up the courage to propose." The words hung in the air between them like something precious and fragile. Mary felt as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. "You never said anything," she whispered. "How could I? You had just lost your husband. You were in an impossible situation. If I had told you I had feelings for you, you might have thought I was taking advantage of your desperation. I wanted you to choose me, not feel trapped into accepting me." Mary stared at him, this man who had saved her family and asked for nothing in return except the chance to prove himself worthy of her affection. "Daniel, Mama, come see what I found." Annie's voice interrupted them as she came running across the yard, her hands cupped carefully around something. Mary and Daniel both turned toward the little girl, and Mary was grateful for the interruption. She needed time to process what Daniel had just told her, to figure out how to respond to a declaration of love she had never expected but found herself wanting desperately to return. As Annie reached the porch and opened her hands to reveal a small field mouse she had apparently befriended. Mary caught Daniel's eye over the child's head. The look they shared was full of promise and possibility, and the kind of understanding that comes when two people realize they want the same thing. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Mary found Daniel in the library reading a book about cattle breeding. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him in the lamplight, and felt something settle into place in her chest. "Daniel," she said softly. He looked up from his book. "Yes?" "Earlier today when you said you were falling in love with me before we were married." "Yes?" Mary walked into the room and sat down in the chair across from him. "I need you to know that I'm falling in love with you now. Not because you saved my family or gave us security." 6 months after their wedding, on a cold February morning that started like any other, everything Mary had built with Daniel nearly came crashing down. She was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard unfamiliar voices in the front yard. Through the window, she could see Daniel talking to a man she didn't recognize. Tall, thin, and wearing clothes that marked him as someone from out of town. The conversation appeared to be growing heated, and Mary felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. She had learned to recognize the signs of trouble, even when she couldn't hear the words being spoken. A few minutes later, Daniel came into the kitchen, his face grim and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Who was that?" Mary asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. "Your brother-in-law," Daniel said. "Thomas's brother, Frank." Mary's blood turned to ice. Frank Johnson was a man she had hoped never to see again. Thomas had rarely spoken of his older brother, and when he did, it was with disappointment and frustration. Frank was the kind of man who always had a scheme to make easy money and always needed someone else to fund it. "What does he want?" Mary asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Money," Daniel said flatly. "He claims Thomas owed him a significant amount of money before he died. He says that debt transfers to Thomas's family, which now means it transfers to me since I married you." Mary sank into a chair at the kitchen table. "How much money?" $5,000. The number hit Mary like a physical blow. $5,000 was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. It was enough to ruin even a successful rancher like Daniel if he couldn't pay it immediately. "Daniel, I swear to you, I had no idea Thomas owed anyone money. He never mentioned any debt to his brother." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and Mary saw something in his expression that made her heart sink. It wasn't anger exactly, but it was doubt. The kind of doubt that made her wonder if he was questioning whether she had known about this debt all along. "Frank says Thomas borrowed the money to buy the house you were living in when he died," Daniel said carefully. "He says Thomas promised to pay it back with interest, but then the mine accident happened." Mary shook her head. "Thomas bought that house with money he saved from working extra shifts at the mine. He was so proud of being able to buy it without borrowing from anyone." "Frank has papers," Daniel said. "Documents that appear to show Thomas's signature on a loan agreement." "Then they're fake," Mary said desperately. "Daniel, you have to believe me. Thomas would never have kept something like that from me. We talked about everything, our money, our plans, our debts. If he had owed his brother $5,000, I would have..."